This morning we're carrying on looking at the book of Mark as we've arrived in the New Testament. We started last week and saw the arrival of the King, and today we are looking in Mark chapters 9 to 16 at the arrival of the King. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, our next date that we'll be meeting after our short break will be the 9th of October when we start looking at the book of Acts. And so for your holiday reading, the book of Acts is what's going to be clear in your mind, but because we've been preaching it in the early part of the day, hopefully it's not going to be completely new to you, but you'll see many things that you're familiar with. Now, last week we started looking at Mark's Gospel, and I used this diagram, this picture, to show you the structure of Mark's Gospel. And Mark began with a very clear description of the gospel. Mark chapter 1, verse 1. He tells us what the gospel is all about. The gospel is about Jesus. We've heard Rat talking about that today, that everything in life should revolve around Jesus. And Mark really begins his gospel in the same way. The beginning of the gospel. What is the gospel about? He tells you. You don't have to guess. You don't have to think about it. He tells you. The gospel is about. Don't you love verses like that? You know, don't argue with me. It's in the Bible. God says it, therefore it's right. The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The gospel is not about good works. The gospel is not about religion. The gospel is not about, church. The gospel is about Jesus and the fact that he is Christ, the Son of God. And having made that great claim, here in these opening phrases, in the introduction, chapter 1, verse 1, he then sets out to prove the identity of Jesus in the next 8 chapters. So he makes a statement, chapter 1, verse 1, and then everybody says, well, gee, that's a big statement. Jesus, that man from Mary and Joseph, whose father was a carpenter, whose mother and brother live here with us, who's just a nobody, who died on a cross. You're telling me he was Christ, the Son of God? Well, Mark, you're going to have to prove your claim, please. That's a big claim. And so Mark says, okay, give me 8 chapters, and I'll prove to you who he is. And at those 8 chapters culminate in chapter 8, verse 29, where Peter declares, you are the Christ. When Jesus says to his disciples, who do people say I am? Peter says, you are the Christ. And what we're going to be looking at today is the 8 chapters that follow Peter's statement. In other words, the second half of Mark's Gospel. And this second half of Mark's Gospel is going to culminate in chapter 15, verse 39, when we meet the centurion at the foot of the cross, who, as he looks and sees how Jesus dies, says, surely this man was the Son of God. Now, most people, when they die, don't prove anything about their identity. But the way in which Jesus dies, in control of his death, shows that he is the Son of God. And so Jesus bows his head, he gives up his spirit, he chooses to die. Can I ask you to do that? Let's see if you can do that. If I say to you, die, go on. You can't. You can take your life, but you can't choose to do it. Jesus gives up his spirit and dies. Even then, he is in control. He's showing his lordship, his sovereignty, his kingly rule, the fact that he is God. He dies. And so this second half is going to culminate and climax here in chapter 15, verse 39, with the centurion. But in the 8 chapters leading up to that, we're going to be seeing today is this man who is Christ, the Son of God, what does he come to do? Or what is his mission? What is the mission of Jesus? And it begins in chapter 8, verse 31. Here's the first section in your notes. Chapter 8, verse 31 to chapter 9, verse 29, where we are told that Jesus explains that he must die and that those who follow him will suffer. Jesus is very honest about who he is and what he has come to do and what it means to follow him. That's one of the reasons why you know that it's Jesus must have been telling the truth. Who do you know who says, if you give your life to following me, I can assure you it's going to be a difficult life. Most people aren't going to think that that's going to be a great sales pitch. And so they try and make things a little bit, follow me, your life's going to be good. And Jesus says, no, it will be hard. So why are you here today? You must think it's worth it, even though Jesus is honest to you and says it will be hard. In chapter 8, Jesus starts talking about his death for the first time, and he emphasizes that it must happen. Chapter 8, verse 31, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. You see, Peter at this point, as he hears that Jesus must die, is like the blind man who we met a few verses earlier. Remember the blind man who, when Jesus opens his eyes for the first time, sees people and they look like trees. It's a little bit murky still. He doesn't quite have it. He can see, but he can't see. And Peter's like that. He hasn't grasped everything. He might have said, you are the Christ, but he doesn't understand what his mission is. You see, he's got this part right, the identity is right, but Jesus is a package deal. It's not just this part that he must get right, he must also get this part right, that he has come to perform a specific mission, namely to die. And until such time as Peter understands both these sections about his identity and his mission, he must keep quiet. So that's why it seems rather strange in verse 30, when Peter has just said, you are the Christ, what does Jesus say? Shut up. Don't tell anyone about this. It's a very dangerous thing going around saying Jesus is the Christ, but not yet understanding what he has come to do. And Peter needs to have both sides of the coin clear in his mind before he can be let loose in the world as a disciple of Jesus, as a witness. And so some people today still are confused about that, aren't they? They would say, yeah, Jesus is Lord, but they don't understand that he has come to die because they don't accept their own sinfulness, for example. Jesus says it's clear. It's very important that you are clear on both sides of his identity and mission. And so Jesus rebukes Peter, Peter rebukes Jesus. Did I say it the other way around? Verse 32, Peter took Jesus aside and rebuked him. He tells Jesus off. And we can have a little bit of sympathy with Peter at this point because we know that Peter knows the Old Testament. Peter knows Psalm 2. He knows 2 Samuel 7. What's 2 Samuel 7? The great covenant with David. And what is that king going to be like who has been promised to David's family? He is going to be eternal. How can you be the eternal king if you die? It doesn't work. Jesus, you can't die. That can't be part of who you are. If you are the Christ, we know you're not going to die. If you are the one enthroned, Psalm 2 says, if you're the Son of God, you won't die. So how can Jesus ever be opposed or die? And Jesus says to him, though, that if you think like that, that is a demonic thing. So in verse 33, Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. It is satanic to think that Jesus did not come to die. It's very clear. It's very important that we are quite clear on that. So identity and mission. Then from verse 34, Jesus calls the crowd together and says that as king he must be followed, but that they must understand that as they follow him, the cross that he will die on, will be the pattern of discipleship. And the way that they were to follow him, the way that you are to follow Jesus, because what does it mean for you to follow Jesus today? How would you follow Jesus? There's no man walking around the streets like they were able to follow. You don't just sit around, I'm here in the Jesus group and here we are walking around. How do you follow Jesus today? Verse 38 tells you that you follow Jesus by responding with obedience to his words. That's how you're marked as a follower of Jesus. If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. To follow Jesus today is seen and measured by what you do with Jesus' words. If you reject his words, you reject Jesus. If you reject Jesus' words, you are rejecting God. And according to how you respond to him and his words, he will respond to you when he returns. That's what verse 38 says. If you're ashamed of his words, he will be ashamed of you. If you're ashamed of him, he'll be ashamed of you. And when will he be ashamed of you? Does verse 38 say? When he returns. So in the space of just a also know that he will return. And we are given a glimpse of what his return will be like in the next section, chapter 9, verses 2 to 29, tell us the story of the Mount of Transfiguration. Moses and Elijah are there. They symbolize the law and the prophets. Jesus has come to fulfill the law and the prophets, which is why God says in chapter 9, verse 7, on the mountain, what must you do with Jesus? Listen to him. We've just heard in chapter 8, verse 38, that you must follow him by obeying his words. And then we meet the two great words people of the Old Testament, Moses, who brings the law, and Elijah, who is a great prophet. And now we are told what to do with Jesus, chapter 9, verse 7. Listen to him. Now, Peter's not been doing that, has he? Peter's been hearing Jesus say, I've come to die. And Peter says, whoa, 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 whoa. No, you haven't. He's not listening to Jesus. And so God is saying to Peter, accept what Jesus is saying about his death and resurrection and his return. Although you don't think it fits the plan of him being eternal, let's be clear, listen to him. He will suffer and die. In other words, the cross is the plan of God. It was no accident that Jesus went on later to die on the cross. It wasn't beyond the plan of God. God says, listen to Jesus as he speaks. Well, as they go down from the Mount of Transfiguration, they're talking about Elijah, Peter, James, and John. And Elijah reminds the disciples of Malachi chapter 4. Do you remember how the Old Testament ended in that chapter? Malachi said that Elijah would come first, and then the Christ would come. Now they've just seen Elijah. Now they think, oh, hold on. Maybe Malachi got the order wrong. Maybe it's Christ first, because we've just said Jesus is the Christ, and now Elijah's come. Or, even worse, if Elijah's just come, then maybe Jesus is not the Christ. Maybe it's someone else. So they're having this discussion about it. And Jesus says, no, actually Elijah has come. How has Elijah come? Well, we are introduced to the Elijah-like figure in Mark chapter 1, John the Baptist. When they get back to the other disciples in chapter 9 and verse 14, they see that the disciples can't drive a demon out of a boy, out of a mute boy. And Jesus says that that type of demon can only come out by prayer. In other words, mankind who is in the grip of supernatural power needs divine intervention. It takes supernatural power to drive out the demon. But then Jesus just drives the demon out. He doesn't pray. What's he doing? He's saying, I am God. I don't need to pray to God to drive the demon out. I don't need to ask God to make this thing happen, for I am God. I can just make it happen, so demon be out. Quite a cool thing. That type of demon only comes out by prayer, but then he doesn't pray, and he drives the demon out. It's a clear indication, again, of his divinity. Next, in chapter 9, verse 30 to chapter 10, verse 30, or next section, Jesus reveals the problem of greatness, sin, and the law. Problem of greatness, sin, and the law, from chapter 9, verse 30 to chapter 10, verse 31. The first three verses, chapter 9, verse 30 and 31, is the second prediction that Jesus makes about his own death. But the disciples still don't understand, and they actually begin arguing in verse 33 about who is the greatest. When Jesus puts a child in their midst in verse 36, he teaches them that greatness is about being other person centered, but that is not how they had been thinking. If you want to be a disciple of Jesus, as he's been telling them they must be, then it's not about looking to see who's going to be the greatest disciple, but rather being willing to humble yourself, even to the point of being willing to serve, as illustrated by those who are willing to welcome by the man who's driving out demons in verse 38. Although he's not part of the 12 disciples, he is serving Jesus. The disciples want to stop him. And Jesus says, no, let him carry on. Jesus' lesson to the disciples is that they needed to get rid of their proud feelings of superiority. Oh, look, we are the 12. And they needed to be willing to serve without being proud of their position. See, it's a good question for ourselves in ministry. Are you happy to serve without anybody seeing the things that you do in church? If no one ever says thank you to you, will you be okay with it? You know, sometimes you have those, I used to run them in church at the end of the year, so you have appreciation dinners, or whatever we used to call them. We say, get everyone together and say thank you to people. And it's a nice thing to do. We should be people of gratitude. We say thank you. And every year I used to go through every ministry in church hoping that I don't overlook anyone. Can you imagine? You list everyone in the church and you leave out what group shall we choose? The people who do creche. Okay, you thank everyone and you leave out the creche workers. If that's you, if your church hosted an appreciation dinner and you have been car guard in the rain for 52 weeks that year, every week you were the car guard, every week it rained, and no one ever said thank you, would you be okay with it if on the appreciation dinner banquet night, no one says thank you to you? Wow, that's a hard one, hey? No one noticed that I did the creche. Are you serving Jesus, or are you serving for being noticed? If you get forgotten, be okay with it. It sometimes happens. And we feel sensitive about that. No one notices. No one cares. Can't you say thank you? Go home and you grumble. Well, you're just like the disciples. I'm just like the disciples. They wanted to be noticed. From verse 42, Jesus says that the consequences of self-centeredness are so serious that you should act drastically, cutting off whatever causes you to sin. But if you remember, if you see there in chapter 9, verse 43, cutting off your hand, remember, cutting off your foot, gouging out your eye, Jesus has already said that sin resides somewhere else. In chapter 7, he said that, remember that little phrase, the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. It is the heart that needs to be dealt with. So, I can't pluck my heart out. And so what's going to be the benefit of cutting off my hand if my real problem is my heart? And to illustrate this here, Mark includes a question about divorce. In chapter 10, not so much because of the subject of divorce, but because of Jesus' answer. Verse 5 is the key. It was because of your hearts that were hard that Moses wrote to you this law, Jesus replied. So because of the hardness of people's hearts, divorce was allowed as a concession. The creation is clear that divorce is not part of God's plan, but the law that God introduced through Moses knew the sinful heart of mankind. We are hopelessly sinful. And so how can we be saved? That's the great question. If we are so sinful that we need to consider cutting off our hands and feet and eyes, and our heart is so wicked, how can we be saved? Well, the next two stories illustrate what needs to happen if people are ever to belong to the kingdom of God. So in chapter 10, verse 13, Jesus says that the kingdom belongs to little children. Little children have nothing. They've got no status, no significance. And that's what sinners need to acknowledge, that before God, I am and have nothing. I've got no status and no significance. So we all come to God in the same way. Guilty, sinners, naked, helpless, hopeless. We don't arrive to God and say, oh, look at my greatness. Take note of me. We come before Him and say, I'm a nobody, which Rat was talking about a few minutes ago. Compare those children and the status that, the way that we are to think of ourselves, compare that to the rich man in verse 17. He has everything, but it is his God. He cannot choose following Jesus over his wealth. Do you remember the story? He thinks he's a good man, but Jesus shows up his sinfulness because he loves wealth. And so he leaves Jesus sad, not inheriting eternal life, because it has remained his God. The big question then is, as verse 26 tells us, the disciples ask, who then can be saved? Because you have a sinful heart, don't you? You have wicked hands and eyes that need to be gouged out. You don't think of yourself as a little child. You don't humble yourself in that way. You come to God with all your greatness. You desire, like the disciples, to sit at the right and left. Well, the next two stories, the question the disciples asked is, who can be saved? And Jesus' answer in verse 26 onwards is that no one can save themselves, but that all things are possible with God. Only He can save. And when He does, He truly blesses people, as verse 30 says. Chapter 10 and verse 30, Jesus says, or verse 29, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and fields, and with them persecutions, and in age to come, eternal life. Again, Jesus' honesty is reflected there. How do you see it? That you'll also receive persecution as you follow Jesus. But look at the long list of blessings. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and fields. I think what he's illustrating there is the church family. That when you come to Jesus and follow Him, you will receive from God a wonderful church family. I think the home is the picture of the church, and those people listed are the people who make up the church. Notice the one group that isn't listed there. Did you notice? No one who has left home or brothers or sister or mother or father or children or fields will fail to receive brothers, sisters, mothers, children. But it doesn't say fathers. Why not? Because in coming to Jesus, you receive the Heavenly Father as your Father. It is so worthwhile following Jesus, to be His disciple. But the question then remains, how will He save? How will He save people? If verse 26 asks, who then can be saved? And Jesus says, with man this is impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God. The question is, how? How will God save people? Well, the next section, chapter 10, verse 32 to chapter 11, verse 25, tells us how God will do that when it says that Jesus is on the way to ransom and judgment. And so the third prediction of the cross is made by Jesus in chapter 10, verse 32 to 34. And still the disciples don't understand, as James and John once again desire greatness in glory. But Jesus says that the way to glory is through servanthood. That the way to glory is by copying Jesus, the one who was the great suffering servant, the one who suffered all the way to death. As Jesus says in chapter 10, verse 45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus is the Redeemer King. Here's why in your diagram it says he has come to bring about the payment of a ransom. Chapter 10, verse 45. He's come to give his life as a ransom for many. The next story in verse 46 of the blind beggar is linked to the one about James and John, in that Jesus asked the same question to him as he asked James and John. So in chapter 10, verse 36, Jesus said to James and John, "What do you want me to do for you?" And in the story of Bartimaeus, blind Bartimaeus, chapter 10 and verse 51, Jesus says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" What did James and John ask for? They asked for greatness. What does Bartimaeus ask for? He says, "Let me see." And so Jesus allows him to see. And this is really the heart of the gospel. This is what blind people like James and John should be asking for. They're asking for greatness, but what they should be asking for is sight. If you're ever going to understand the way of Jesus' kingdom, you need to be able to see. You need to have understanding. You need a miracle. If you're ever going to get this thing about the identity and the mission of Jesus, you need your eyes open. You need to be able to recognize him for who he really is. So it would be right to say of the people walking around us who aren't Christians, they are blind. Many might get an aspect of it. They might see that Jesus is God. They might even say that. But they haven't really come to full understanding. They're still blind because they don't accept his mission, that he came to die for them. Or they might know what he did. They might believe the historical truths that there was a man called Jesus who died on the cross and that his mission was to save people, but they ignore the fact that his identity demands that they follow him, that they live for him, that they obey him, they submit to him. You need a miracle to open your eyes so you accept both parts about Jesus. You might be able to divide your own life like that there was a time when you got one of these parts right and the other part wrong. And then only when Jesus opened your eyes did you come to understand who he really was. And then you could really call yourself a Christian, a true disciple of Jesus. In chapter 11, Jesus enters Jerusalem, where he said he was going to die. He enters as a humble king riding on a donkey. And at first the crowd proclaims him, shouting that he is the king, Hosanna, which means, "Lord, save us," which is what he has come to do. So it looks great. They recognize what he has come to do. It looks good as he enters Jerusalem. The prophet Malachi said that when the king came, he would go to the temple. Maybe you remember that from Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. He says when the Christ comes, he'll go to his temple and he will clean it. And that's what Jesus does. He heads for the temple. But on either side of his visit to the temple, Mark mentions a fig tree. Well, what's so important about the fig tree? In verse 12, the fig tree is in leaf. If you've never farmed with figs, how many of you are fig farmers? You might not know that a fig tree is a little bit odd in that it first produces fruit. And then when the tree's bare, the first thing that happens is it produces figs, and then the leaves follow afterwards. Mostly it's the other way around, the leaves first, and then you see your apple or your peach growing there afterwards. The fig tree works differently. So when there is a fig tree with leaves on it, what should you expect? That it should also have figs on it. If you see an apple tree, it's not necessarily going to have, if you see an apple tree with leaves, it's not necessarily going to have apples on it. But if you see a fig tree with leaves on it, it should also have figs on it. So this tree was full of the appearance of being fruitful, but it wasn't. It had no figs. It was an empty show, which is what the temple was like. The temple was religiously active. If you wanted to get a picture of spiritual health, it would have been the temple. It would have looked so healthy. There it was, priests dressed up, animals being sacrificed, offerings being made, people coming, praying. It looked so religious, but it was spiritually dead. It was just a show. It was full of superstitious rituals. It had no sincere faith. And so the cursing of the fig tree that Jesus did before he goes to the temple, he curses the fig tree, is the explanation of what Jesus is doing in the temple when he turns the tables over. Remember, he goes into the temple, he looks around, sees this religious show, and what does he do? He flips all the tables over, drives people out, he's really angry. He is cursing the temple. He is doing to the temple what he had just done to the fig tree. The next day, in verse 21, chapter 11, verse 21, Peter sees that the fig tree is dead. Quite a thing. Jesus, the previous day, curses the fig tree. There it is in verse 14. Jesus says to the fig tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." The disciples hear him say this, and he walked past the tree the next day, it's dead. That's quite a thing. You know, I've killed most plants that come into our house, I must say. My wife and I, we're not so good with plants. But I've never been able to kill a plant in one day, be dead. And the next day it's dead. And here's this fig tree. Peter remembers verse 21, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." You can imagine, look. And what is Peter saying? Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." And then Jesus responds in this, what we might think is a strange way, verse 22, "Have faith in God. I tell you the truth, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. When you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins." It seems like an odd answer to Peter's question, but you see what Peter is saying. When he says, "Lord, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered," he's thinking what has happened in the temple the day before is that Jesus has cursed the temple, and his thinking is this: the temple is cursed, and all that it stands for is under judgment. But how can we be God's people without a temple? How can we be God's people without God's presence among us? How can we be God's people without a sacrificial system? Peter's really concerned because he's just seen the cursing of the temple. How can we function as the people of God without the temple? And Jesus says, if the temple goes the same way as the fig tree goes, namely to be cursed, have faith in God. Chapter 11, verse 22. Trust God. Trust this God who can do impossible things, especially that of saving people. He can do it even without the greatest symbol of old Israel. He can save people without the temple. Peter's learning a big lesson. God can act separate from the temple. And how's he going to do that? How can God save people without a temple? Well, you know the answer. And Peter's about to discover that. And they really do need saving, because in the next section, chapter 11, verse 27 to chapter 12, verse 44, Jesus shows up Israel's fruitlessness. We've just seen a fig tree who had no fruit and the cursing of the temple, and now Jesus is going to show up Israel's fruitlessness. Jesus' actions in the temple that day didn't win him any friends. Can you imagine what it would have been like? All the religious leaders, the priests, they were furious. But the crowd was on Jesus' side. And so the religious leaders try and get the crowd on their side. They realize they don't have a lot of, it's like the politicians of it. They've got to have the crowd to follow you. How do you get the crowd on your side? And so they try and trap Jesus with some tricky questions. Let's show Jesus up to be a fraud. But of course, all that happens when they ask Jesus tricky questions is that he in turn traps them in their questions and shows up their fruitlessness. The first trap comes in chapter 11, verse 27, when they ask where Jesus' power and authority comes from. But Jesus in turn asks where John the Baptist's authority and power came from. And no matter how they answered, they would have been trapped. If they said John the Baptist's power came from men, the crowd would have been angry because they thought that his power came from God. And if he said that John the Baptist's power came from God, then Jesus would have said to them, why didn't you listen to what he said then? So they've been shown up there. chapter 12, tells us that God's messengers, the prophets, had always been opposed and killed like John the Baptist had been. This was the way that they had treated John in not listening to him, was in line with the way they had always treated the Old Testament prophets. They had always been fruitless as a nation. And now that God had sent his son, it wasn't going to be any different. But even though they knew that in verse 12 of chapter 12, that Jesus was speaking against them, what a damning verse that is, chapter 12, verse 12. They knew that he had spoken the parable against them. They failed to respond because they are still blind. They haven't had their eyes opened. They need a miracle.
Jesus was pretty much declaring judgment on these religious leaders by showing them that that's what that was the parable of the tenants.
Absolutely.
Showing them that that's how they behave as tenants to the service that had come. Blah, 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 blah.
That's right.
Whole analogy. So he was judging them.
Yep. Absolutely. Was Jesus judging those people in the parable of the tenants? He's showing that he's judging the people because they don't respond to him as they should have. The second trap comes in chapter 12. It's one of my favorite stories in the Gospels, where they ask Jesus if they should pay taxes to the Romans or not. Either way, they'd be in trouble. If they say, pay taxes if he says, yes, you must pay taxes to the Romans, then they're going to be supporting Rome, and the Jews didn't like to support Rome. If he said, don't pay taxes, then he'd be in trouble with the Romans. So, very good question. But his answer is, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And the coin has a picture of Caesar on it, so I guess if your face is on the coin, it must be your coin. So it says, if you ask for it back, then give it to him. But then he adds something. He says, and give to God what is God's. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. How do you know what is Caesar's? His image is on it. How do you know what is God's? Where is his image seen? Where is God's image seen? We are made in the image of God. So if Caesar's image must be given back to him, then God's image must be used to serve him. And who is that? Well, that's us. Give to God what is God's. Give yourself to God. You are God's, so give yourself to him. So again, Jesus traps them in their question. The third trap comes in chapter 12, verse 18. If a woman like my sister has been married 7 times, well, my sister's been married 3 times, who will she be married to in heaven? If Jesus says that there is no resurrection, like the Sadducees said, he'd be rejecting the Old Testament, and people would reject him. If he said that she's going to be married to all of them in heaven, then he's accepting polygamy. Jesus' reply traps them, though. He says there is a resurrection, as illustrated in chapter 12, verse 26, where he says that God described himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though they had been dead for hundreds of years, so they were alive. They had been raised. But while there was resurrection life, there was no marriage in heaven, Jesus said. And so again, he traps them, even as they tried to trap him with that question. The next incident is a bit more positive, though. In chapter 12, verse 34, one of the scribes shows that he has understood that the law is about love. It's not about religious externals. And Jesus says that anyone who understands this is close to the kingdom. But not all the teachers of the law showed that they had that much understanding. So in chapter 12, verse 35, Jesus says that the Old Testament expected the Lord, who David looked forward to as his Lord, to come. And even though the scribes taught that, they did not believe it. And now that Jesus had come as great David's greater son, he was being rejected. Okay, so they're quoting from Psalm 110 there, chapter 12, verse 36. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. They were looking forward to the Lord coming, but even though the Lord had now come, great David's greater son, that's Jesus, had come, they rejected him. And so Jesus warns the crowds in verse 38 about the scribes who are more interested in status than in service. Contrast them to the widow in verse 41, who gives everything she has in the service of God. She holds nothing back. She serves him fully. Okay, well now, having predicted his death 3 times in chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10, Jesus now looks beyond his death, as we see in chapter 13. Jesus is going to be looking ahead on into the future. What will happen beyond Jesus' death? Here's some teaching from Jesus about the future, a future that has partly now come and partly not yet come. But for them, in that day, none of it had come. Got it? Let's see how. So Jesus explains judgment and the end. This is chapter 13 in your notes now. And so in chapter 13, he says that the temple will go, but that the final judgment will be delayed. Obviously, this section builds on what happened in chapter 11 when Jesus cursed the temple. But as Jesus talks about the end of the end coming to the temple, the disciples think that the destruction of the temple will not just be the end of Judaism, but of the world. But Jesus says that the destruction of the temple will only be a sign that will point towards the coming of the end of the world. So the day the temple closes will not necessarily be the same day that the world ends, which we, of course, know to have been true. When was the temple destroyed? AD 70. Temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Did the world end on that day? Clearly not. You're still here. So there's a gap. And Jesus said there will be other signs. That would be one of the signs, but there would be other signs. He said there would be false messiahs. There have been many of those in the world, haven't there? Still, there's some in Durban. There'd be wars and rumors of wars. We've had plenty of those. There'd be earthquakes, plagues, and famines. That's ordinary, everyday stuff. All of those have been common, and they stand as warnings of the coming of the end. Jesus also said in verses 9 to 13 that believers would be persecuted even by family, but that the gospel must be preached to all nations, which is what we are to do still today. Then in verse 14 to 23, Jesus describes the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, which Jesus said that would be so awful that people would flee for their lives. And that's what happened in AD 70. We know from history that it was dreadful as the Romans absolutely trashed the temple and the city. But worse than that will be the end of time. Verses 24 to 27 tell us that after the fall of Jerusalem, there would be cosmic fireworks and final judgment as Jesus returns. He'll gather the elect and he'll take them to glory. Now, the time of those events is unknown. Jesus says in verse 28 to 35 that his people should learn a lesson from the fig tree, that when its leaves appear, you know that summer is close. And so be prepared for the events of the coming judgment. So Jesus' coming is close. Still today, we say it's close. But there is a delay between Jerusalem's destruction and the final judgment, which we know to be true, don't we? AD 70 was a long time ago, and we're still waiting, but it's close. And the purpose of the delay between the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the world is what? Chapter 13, verse 10 tells us, the gospel must first be preached to all nations. That's what we need to be doing. That's what you exist for. That's what your mission is. Doesn't matter what job you have. I don't care if you're a high-powered lawyer. I don't care if you become the president. If you're a Christian, you have one task. Make sure that the gospel becomes known. And the purpose of the gospel being preached is so that the blessing of Genesis 12, verse 3 will happen. That the nations will be blessed as the gospel is preached. Chapter 14 takes us back to the mission of Jesus. What Jesus had been predicting now begins to come true as Jesus heads towards death. But what is staggering is that Jesus came to die for failures. That's a surprise of chapter 14. Other than the woman of the first story, verses 3 to 9, who pours perfume on Jesus' feet, Jesus faces constant opposition in that chapter. The religious leaders want him dead. Judas is willing to take money to betray him. Something which Jesus predicts. But it's not just Judas who's out to get Jesus. In verse 27, Jesus says everyone will disown him. In verse 30, Jesus specifically says that Peter will disown him, and that's what happens. Peter, James, and John fail to stay awake and pray for Jesus in the garden. Judas betrays Jesus. In verse 51, there's a strange little verse that tells us that someone ran away naked, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment who was following Jesus. When they seized Jesus, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. And we think, who is that? Why did they bother to write that? It's probably Mark. It's probably the author of this book saying, me too, I was there. I was a young man at the time. I was there. I also disowned him. I also, when I should have been there, ran away. I was so scared I was willing to run away naked. In verse 56, false witnesses testify against Jesus. And at the end of the chapter, Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus said he would do. Yet what will Jesus do for these people, these ones who disown him, who betray him, who deny him? Well, in chapter 14, verses 12 to 26, we're told that he will die as the Passover lamb for these failures. The Lord's Supper, the night before he was killed, Jesus explains that he will die for them. This is my body given for you. Now that's also the emphasis in chapter 14, verse 43 onwards, the next section. It tells us that Jesus, the perfect one, will die for these failures. Jesus, who is perfectly innocent, dies for failures. Jesus' trial and Peter's trial, if you want to call it that, are interconnected in this passage. Jesus is on trial about the truth, and Peter fails to tell the truth. Time and time again, Jesus is shown to be without fault. And so when he dies, it will be for who he is, not for what he has done, for he has done nothing wrong. Chapter 14, verse 61, we read, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Chapter 15, verse 2, "Are you the King of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. Earlier the crowd had shouted, "Hosanna," they wanted to be saved. But now they cry for Jesus to be crucified and for Barabbas to be released to them, because in their minds, at least Barabbas had tried to save them. Ironically, Jesus will deliver what they want when they cry for him to be crucified. So ironic. And so in chapter 15, verse 16, to the end of the book, Jesus' mission is accomplished. Finally, Jesus is crucified and dies, just as the Old Testament said would happen to the Christ. It really is the lowest point in history. Nothing lower, no worse day in history than that day when Jesus died. As we think of the great promises that God made to Abraham and David, we see that God's king is dead. We see that God's people have deserted him. We see that the nation is ruled by the Romans. And in place of blessing, there is darkness and there is judgment. It is the lowest day. Abraham's covenant seems completely unfulfilled. David's covenant seems completely unfulfilled. But ironically, it is the very moment that all the promises are being fulfilled, which you start seeing from verse 38 onwards, as the curtain of the temple is torn in two by that action of God, made possible by Jesus suffering the judgment of God in their place. God was opening the way for sinful man to know the holy God. And we know that the mission of Jesus was successful, because chapter 16 tells us that Jesus rose from the dead as the vindicated Son of God. And so because everything happened just as Jesus said it would happen, we can believe what else he said about the things that have not yet happened. Remember, chapter 13 said that he will one day return. Why should we believe that he will one day return? Because so far, everything that he has said has come true. The promises have been kept. Which leaves us with that one great task of doing what chapter 13 said we should do until he comes again. Namely, to preach the gospel to all nations. Which is why you're here. That's your great task. There's limited time. So let's get on and continue doing that great work. Next week we'll look at the book of Acts, which tells us how the gospel is taken to the nations. We see that beginning to happen and unfold as Christians are obedient to their calling to make Jesus' name famous throughout the world. So get down and read Acts chapter 16 for the 9th of October. That's when we're meeting again. 9th of October, your reading will be for that day then. Yes, Marge?
Just with regard to the cursing of the temple, does it cursing of the tables?
Yep. Not in words. He didn't curse it with words, no. But he curses it by his actions of driving them out. He's saying that he's displeased with what they are doing in the temple. That which they had used the temple for, he says, is not acceptable. And he uses the words from Jeremiah, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. So he might not use the words, I cursed the temple, but he said, I am displeased with what you are doing here. But you understand that it's cursed because you see the fig tree stories on either side of that. You've got fig tree, temple, fig tree. Fig tree cursed, fig tree cursed. What's Jesus doing in the middle? He's not cursed. It's not about a fig tree. Who cares about a fig tree? It's just a fig tree. It's a temple that he's talking about. It is cursed because of their way that they have treated it as a den of robbers rather than as a house of prayer. Good, let's have some tea and coffee and enjoy some eats together.